describing depression to someone who's never really been depressed is like describing the color red to a blind person.
Right.
You don't have the language. But I think my intent for it was, when I wrote it, was for it to be cathartic. But the thing was, I realized through therapy that it was very important for me to tell the people in my life that I was suffering and how I was suffering. And I didn't know how to do that. I didn't know how to have that conversation with 15 different people, right, or how to start it. And so it ultimately became easier to write an article to millions of strangers, that anyone could access, than it was to sit down with my friend and tell him.
Welcome to the Less Than Obvious podcast. I'm your host, Jim McDonald. My guest, John Romaniello, is the New York Times bestselling author of Engineering the Alpha, along with John Bornstein, which in many ways provides answers to a lot of the kinds of questions guys sometimes have trouble asking out loud. He's also trained celebrities and regular people, appeared on TV, and probably more podcasts than he wants to think about. If you read The 4-Hour Chef by Tim Ferriss, he's the guy in the Ice Cream Challenge chapter. I've known him since long before any of that, before I was involved in what we now refer to as the fitness industry, or had any desire to be. Here's your heads up that this episode contains frank discussions in grown-up language about real issues like depression, suicide, relationships, and sexuality. Just the kind of things that people have a difficult time talking about sometimes, or bringing up with friends, or asking questions about. Having said all that, let's jump into the conversation. Okay, so the premise of the show is basically it's the road not taken as a podcast. So some decision that you made, or some series of decisions that you made in your life that people around you kind of went, like, why would he do that? And then what was the outcome? And why did you make that particular decision? What were you thinking about? What was did you go through the Franklin pros and cons scenario? Was there any?
I mean, oh goodness, that's hard. I mean, how far back do we go?
That's entirely up to you.
Yeah. I'm not great when I make rational decisions. And by that, I mean, there have been a number of occasions when I have made the decision that made the most sense, given all of the factors. And usually this is some sort of financial, like there's a piece of it that is financial. And I make the decision that's like responsible, and then I wind up miserable. And I realize that we've all got decision-making centers, and we have to figure out how to understand ourselves in a way that allows you to make the decisions that work for you. And I'll just use a very, very stupid example from when I was a little bit younger, that it taught me that I need to be making decisions more from my gut and to, in a very real extent, like with my dick, like, like things that get your dick hard are they work out well for me. And so, when I was, I think 24, I bought my first new car, which was a Honda Accord, and I loved it. It was like a 2005 Honda Accord, 4-door, and it had leather seats. For whatever reason, have always indicated success to me. In any event, had it for a few years.
I can't argue with you on that point.
Yeah, leather seats. It's like, feels like you've arrived, especially when you're in your early 20s. Had it for a few years. It was great. Unfortunately, my mother totaled it, which was she was fine. She just spun out and the car got totaled. And so I needed a new car. And I had just recently become very environmentally conscious in a way where I was trying to make all the right decisions. And I was at that point maybe 26, and I had just moved in with my first very, very serious girlfriend, and I was trying to make like smart, reliable, responsible decisions. Right. And I needed a new car, and so I weighed all of these factors, and the outcome was that I should get a Volkswagen Jetta. Okay. It was the right price, and it was it was good on gas, etc. But I didn't really love the car, but I just thought, your car is to get you from point A to point B. You don't need to love it. And, I grew up without money, but I grew up as a poor kid in a wealthy neighborhood. And so I always got to, see people like 17-year-old kids driving BMWs and you sort of grow up fetishizing certain things. And obviously, when you grow up a poor kid in a rich neighborhood, you like just hate rich kids. And so I never had the thing that I wanted. I always had the thing that I could afford. And when I got older, I should have realized that doesn't work for me. And so I bought this jet, or leased this Jetta, and I drove it for a while, and then I hated it. Every time I got in the car, I hated the car. I didn't like driving. I didn't like being seen in it. I had this weird thing, and obviously vehicles are not gendered, but I was like, this is a very feminine car, and I don't.
Some cars are very feminine.
Yeah, and I guess I was sort of like at the height of my heteronormative, masculine embrace, and eventually I moved into Manhattan instead of living on Long Island, where I didn't even need a car anymore. No longer needed a car. I had the car, so I brought it with me. And I used the car to travel, not within Manhattan, because that would be crazy, but rather back and forth from Manhattan to Long Island.
Okay.
To see my mother, etc. And then one day, I was driving to Long Island from the city, and it was very late spring, so it was a very hot day out. It was sunny. It was gorgeous. And I drive past this Jeep dealership, and they've got a Wrangler with the doors off and the top down, and it was parked like at an angle on a rock, the way that they display them. Yeah. And this was in 2011, maybe. And so it was when my business started to really, really do well. 2010 was a very good year for me. It was my first 6-figure year online. And 2011, I was on pace for 7. And I saw this Jeep, and I spun a U-turn, and I drove into the dealership, and I wound up talking to this guy, Dave, and I pointed to the car and I said, I hate what I drive. I need that. I want to leave with it, and I have 3 hours. Can you help me? And he had never seen anything. He was like, what? I was like, I'm sorry. I want to repeat myself. I'm currently leasing a Jetta. I fucking hate it. I want that orange Jeep, and I have exactly 3 hours, and I would prefer to leave with the car today. Can you help me? And so what wound up happening was everyone was just like, who the fuck is this guy? And it was the first time I ever got to feel truly successful. And I've never gotten to experience what it's like to have fuck you money, but it was the first time I've ever got to experience money where I was like, well, fuck me a little bit. And so I wound up leasing this 4-door orange Jeep Wrangler. And keep in mind, I was living in Manhattan. I didn't need a car.
Right.
And I was already leasing a different car, so they had to get me out of the lease on the Jetta and put me into the Wrangler. And so I wound up upside down on my lease. And so and my credit was great. And so this car, leasing this Jeep should have cost me maybe $360 a month. Uh-huh. And my lease payment, because I was upside down on the Jetta, was like $520. Oh. And so I'm just paying 40% more than I should be. And I have never once in my life regretted that decision. I just looked at this car and I was like, I fucking need that. And I left with the car that day. And I drove up to my mother's place, and she's like, what is this? And I said, this is my new thing. I bought it because I wanted it. And every time I got in that car, I felt powerful. I felt successful. It was emblematic of all of the things that I had worked for. And it taught me that money is a lot of things. It is not just a currency. Mm-hmm. And it can, it can't buy happiness, but it can buy things that make you happy. And for me, this Jeep was this sort of physical manifestation of not just having money, because that's sort of fleeting, right, but rather being able to do something I wanted and not have to be purely calculated about it, and not have to, it didn't have to remind me of shopping for school when I was a poor kid, and I was 13 and I could never afford to buy the right clothes. And I just got to have the exact thing I wanted because I wanted it. And it really shaped a lot of my decision making from then on. And I realized when I make particularly financial decisions, I'm not an idiot. I don't, but when certain things, I have learned that my decision making is often emotional, and I'm okay with that. And most of the time, those decisions have been ones that I haven't regretted. And anytime I sort of forget that and make a purely like, well thought out mathematical decision, I always wind up hating it.
So as soon as you saw that Jeep, basically you were already picturing yourself in it, and everything about it was...
It felt right. It was like, that is, when it was, I don't know. Again, now that I've been in Manhattan so long, my attachment to cars has really faded. But when you grow up on Long Island and, like the kind of car you drive is sort of part of like the clothes you dress, it's how you present yourself to the world. To me, like having this residual self-image of, just wanting to be cool and like kind of, it's like had long hair and it was surfing and everything, it was like a very Long Island thing. And, looking at the Jetta, I was like, I don't make sense in this car. Right. And then looking at the Ring, I was like, I make sense in it. It makes sense for me. And it did. It made sense for me in every conceivable way, except that I in no way needed the vehicle. And, I wound up now paying $500 a month for the lease, and then also, $250 a month to park it in the city, and, did not use it that often. But every time I got in it, like even when I was sitting in traffic on my way back to Long Island, I was like, this is fine. I fucking love this thing.
Well, sometimes it is about the way things make you feel. And so in that pattern of decision making, then, have there been times that you did regret where
I made the decision that I was like, like pretty much anything with women, where I made like an impulsive decision was like probably a bad idea. And there's probably a few of those that if I thought hard, I could dig into. But, yeah, there was one in particular, and it was actually my decision to, well, even that was sort of considered, but my decision to move to California in 2013 was sort of impulsive in that I moved the timetable up pretty dramatically. At the time, I was recently engaged to Nagar, my now ex, and we had sort of planned to live in New York for 2 years and then relocate out to LA. And I was going back and forth a lot to write Engineering the Alpha with Adam Bornstein, who was living in Santa Monica at the time. And he and I wrote every word of that book head to head. I would fly out for 5 days and then he'd come back to New York for 5 days and then we'd take some time off. And so I was really spending a lot of time in Santa Monica, and I sort of fell in love with it. And I thought, this can be for me someday, maybe not now. And Neg is from LA, she grew up in Burbank. And so we had this, sort of idea that we will do that eventually. We were looking at places in New York. But one day we just walked out of the house. We were living in the West Village at the time, or I was living in the West Village and she was always there. And it was, I looked at the weather on my phone and it was 0 degrees. And then with the wind chill, for those who have not been in New York City, these buildings create this crazy wind tunnel effect. It was like -10, or if, feels, quote unquote, feels like -10. And if you live in New York full time, you just sort of get used to that, and you deal with it, and all of the things that you get in New York are more than worth that trade-off. But I wasn't living in New York full time. I was spending so much time in LA that having this contrast all of a sudden seemed really big, and I impulsively just said, fuck it, let's just go to LA now. And I made this impulsive decision that we were going to move the timetable up and that we would just move to LA. And she was obviously all about it because that's where she was from. And so that's what we did. We started planning. We, moved across country from 2 different places, her from Maryland, me from New York, relocated, and I fucking hated it. And I have regretted few things more. And that has nothing to do with the relationship with Nagar or any of the stuff about how it worked out. I just realized that for me, LA is it's a great place to visit and a real shitty place to live. But more importantly, New York is an amazing place for me to live and a very, very shitty place for me to visit. And that I couldn't realize until after the fact. But when I was coming home and visiting friends and, like it was, I hated feeling like a tourist in my own city, like looking at hotels or sleeping on couches. And it was just very weird. And as for LA, I don't know. I tried. I think that I tried a lot, for a while. I just, I tried not to come back to New York. I tried to just be in LA. And I just couldn't do it. There was so much about LA that just doesn't agree with me.
So what effects did that have, being in LA or regretting the decision?
Well, it certainly damaged my relationship with Neg. And, because I think that there were a number of pieces of real incompatibility with the two of us that we didn't recognize because we moved very, very quickly in our courtship and our marriage. But even if the only problem in a marriage was that she's completely in love with LA and I think that New York is the absolute center of the universe and anyone who doesn't want to live there is crazy. Even if that were the only thing, that is enough to drive a wedge in most marriages. But, it was very difficult for me because it wasn't just that I was giving up New York. It was also my support system. I thought that I'd have all these built-in friendships with Bornstein, who moved back to Colorado thereafter, and a couple of other people. And I just, LA is not a city where you hang out with your friends all the time, whereas New York is. And as an extrovert, that is very important to me. And so I think that being out there contributed to my depression, my first real depressive episode in a couple of years. And there's just something to be said for sort of hating where you live. It really fucks with you. And longing for, being homesick is a really profound feeling. And it made me feel very trapped, right? Because a lot of times you go to college and you're homesick and you don't have the option to really leave. You got to do college. You got to be there.
You're pretty stuck. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas in this particular situation, I felt trapped. I felt claustrophobic because I sort of could leave at any given time. Like I could just be like, I'm the breadwinner of the family primarily. And I've decided that this doesn't work and it's not for me. And I never wanted to do that. It would have been uprooting Isaac a second time, and Neg was very happy and to be back with all her friends. And I just, it really fucked with me, and it made me unhappy in so many ways. And that made Neg unhappy. It really became a thing. And I don't know, maybe LA is the most amazing place in the world. It's hard for me to say that it's amazing for me. I got used to it in a lot of ways. It's gorgeous. It's nice to be near Golds.
Yeah.
But it was like a real problem.
I kind of feel the same way about both New York and LA. Like they're great places for me to visit and even like extended visit, but I don't want to live in either one of them.
Sure.
Because I just don't have the level of comfort with each one. I lived in LA and I did LA for a year and a half, 2 years, and it was plenty. I didn't like how long it took to get from one place to another, and that was a problem because there were cool things to do that were spread out all over the place.
Yeah,
and just the thought that you would have to put so much time into getting there and getting back, is something that you would be like. You go to a movie that is only showing some weird place in Glendale or whatever, and it's a 2-hour movie and it's an hour and a half each way to get there, at least some days, sometimes worse. We were in LA about a month ago, stayed in Hollywood, and just driving into Hollywood from the hills was a nightmare.
Yeah. It's really interesting. You learn a lot when you live in a place. And I think that every city takes on a different personality when you live there. And, I think, let me just say this. I think a big part of the issue for me was moving from New York City to Santa Monica. And it was a big jump from the busiest metropolis in the world to, a pretty sleepy part of LA. If I had moved from Long Island to Santa Monica, I might have loved it. If I had moved from New York to West Hollywood, I might have loved it. But so the contrast was perhaps too much. But one thing is that, everybody complains about how flaky LA people are, and it is true. But when you live there, you sort of become flaky in a weird way, and it's because of the sheer exhaustion, the activation energy to do things. And, you make plans. You live in Venice. You make plans to, hang out with a friend who lives in West Hollywood a couple of days from now. And that is like 7.9 miles as the crow flies. But it takes you an hour and a half to get there. And just sort of like the days leading up to it, you're like, I don't know. And then you wake up that morning, you're like, oh, I got to go do this fucking thing. And like almost nothing seems worth it. And then when your friend cancels on you, you're like, oh, thank God. When, which is shitty. But the thing that is most profound about that is it really inhibits your ability to make new friends. And I notice in New York, I make friends very easily because if I meet a cool person and we exchange information, I'm like, hey, this Friday, my friends and I are going out for drinks. Just like come by. And I know that it's not a hassle for them to get there. And I know that it's New York. And if they don't like it, they could just bounce. And that's how, we just sort of adopt people into our friend group.
Right.
And so, yeah, it was, again, I think LA is great for so many people, not for me. So that, but it was an impulsive decision. And, I often wonder what my life and my marriage would have looked like had we done 2 years in New York. Like if I had hit that depressive state and I had a real support system around me of people other than Neg, who, I will, Neg just flat out saved my life on several occasions in terms of just being there for me. But if I didn't have to rely so heavily on her and I didn't have to feel guilty about, there's something, about being depressed where you're just like, oh, I'm so much work. I wish I wasn't this much work for this person.
So there's a guilt factor.
Yeah, that's for me by far the worst part about depression is being acutely aware of how everyone around me is being affected by it. And that's always been the hardest thing for me.
That's an interesting look at it because I think I don't know. I know that that's true of people with other kinds of like chronic illnesses or acute illnesses when they have to rely on other people for help, getting to the doctor or being in the hospital and relying on a family member to be there to help them because kind of the worst thing you can do to a family member who is in the hospital is not be there for them. Yeah. And you think, oh, they're being taken care of. And it's not really true.
Right.
I mean, they're being taken care of in the most basic medical way, but none of their emotional needs and a lot of their physical needs are not being taken care of.
Yeah. Everyone I know who suffers from depression, particularly sort of cyclical depression, sees the difference in how they affect people when they're not depressed versus when they are. And it's impossible not to feel like you're a burden. It's not even that you need people to do things for you. You just see the energetic shift in any given human around you based on you. And you just sort of know that you being sad is hurting them and making them sad. And then you like, well, I can't just stop being sad. And I feel guilty about that. And then, probably one of the biggest areas of my life where I've made progress in the past 2 years is dealing more effectively with meta feelings, which are your feelings about your feelings. And so rather than being, if you get angry about something and then feel like, oh, I can't believe I got angry about this. It's such a stupid thing. I'm so dumb. Like, why can't I just like accept things? You just now you feel guilty and about being angry instead of just so. Trying not to do that has been really helpful for me. But yeah, I often wonder what the road not taken would have been if I had stayed in New York and maybe I wouldn't have hit the depression, or maybe things would have gone differently, or I have no idea.
Or just on a basic level, if you had come to be in a relationship with somebody who wanted to live in New York.
Sure. Right. Right. But, in my own, deep fantasies of self-recrimination where I make everything my fault, ultimately.
You can let go of that one.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, I think it's more there was never a point where I fantasized about Negar being different.
Okay.
I was never hoping that she would change her mind and want to move to New York, or that she would wake up and decide she wanted to be polyamorous. It was always, I hope and pray that I can wake up tomorrow and be happy in California, or be better at monogamy, or whatever else. And I just it's always me. There's this there's this game, I'm sure you're familiar with it, called 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. And
yes,
so the premise there is that Kevin Bacon is so pervasive in Hollywood that if you name a movie or a character or an actor, you can, within 6 steps, relate that back to Kevin Bacon. All depressed people, whether they know it or not, play a version of that game, and it's 6 degrees of self-recrimination. And it's I'm particularly good at this. I can make anything my fault. Anything in the world that's ever gone wrong with anyone's life, right, I can find a way to make it my fault. And most depressed people do that. And so, there's never been any like real desire to change anyone but me, because you are utterly convinced that you are the problem.
That's interesting, because I know a lot of people who pretty much, I don't know that they're depressed people, but they're people who are not thinking as clearly as they might, like to make everything somebody else's fault and not their own fault, not take responsibility for their own shit, as it were.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that as well, and I think that probably has to do with having depression or anxiety in concert with some other, like low-grade illness. I happen to, I happen to have a hero complex, and I like need to save people, because that is sort of how I gained affection and approval from my mother. But I also, I'm like a very low-grade narcissist, and so like only a person who is a narcissist on some level can really believe that everything is their fault. If you don't think that, if you're not if you're actually capable of believing that like something is, that has nothing to do with you, is in some way your fault, and you could find a way to feel bad about that, you're kind of a narcissist. You're like, and I don't say it to really be anything other than truthful. Like, it's something that I work on, and it's but something that I've acknowledged about myself. I really believe that a lot of shit is my fault, and I have ultimately been able, through the careful application of psychedelics, to sort of explore what that is and where that comes from.
Okay, I have a tick list in my head of things that we're going to come back to.
Okay.
But the question I'm going to ask now has to do with something that a lot of people know you for that is not the book. The article that you wrote for your blog about depression. Tell me about the thought process around deciding to write and then release that.
Okay. So this is 2015. If I recall correctly, it was published in September of 2015. So 9 months prior to that, on December 31st of 2014, I had a suicide attempt, and what mental health professionals call a sincere attempt, which means that it was not a cry for help. It was not just me punishing myself in some way. It was not an attempt to mutilate myself. It was a very honest attempt to end my life. And I was, as many people are, unsuccessful in my attempt, obviously. And when I woke up, I didn't feel much. I was still numb, but I didn't immediately feel happy that I had failed, and I didn't really feel sad that I had failed. But when I had gotten a hotel room, and I'd probably the least reliable way to try to kill yourself is alcohol and pills. It can work, but it's certainly not as cut and dry as a gun or something of that nature. But so when I left the hotel and I went back home, what I did feel was intense shame. intense shame about having made the attempt, and the idea that there was no note. I just thought, what kind of terrible person would do this? I locked myself in a hotel room and I just tried to kill myself. And had I been successful, I simply would not have come home. And no one would have known, and some maid would have found me, and then from there they would have had to work to track down my wife. And think about like all the people you're inconveniencing with that task, and you've irrevocably changed the life of everyone who comes in contact with it, because it's not just your kid has lost his father and your wife has lost her husband and your friends have lost their friend. It's also like there's that maid who gets for the rest of her life, she's saddled with that story of like, oh, there was that time that I worked at this hotel and I walked in and I found this fucking guy dead.
Right.
And it was intense shame. And so I didn't tell anyone.
At all?
No, I did not tell.
How did you manage that? Because I don't know. My impulse in those situations, even if I feel shitty about something that I've done, is eventually it bubbles to the surface because I cannot keep it down. Like I have to share it with somebody because I can't dissipate it by myself.
I'm particularly good at compartmentalization, I think. So I didn't tell anyone for at least 6 months, and then Negar and I were in couples therapy, which so much of that was just about us learning to communicate, partially about my depression, right? Mm-hmm. So something to know is that I was diagnosed with depression when I was 17, and I didn't tell anyone my entire life. My mom knew, and then I took my medication, and then none of my friends knew. Not a single, like I'm talking about guys that I've known since I'm 15 years old, with whom I'm still friends to this day, best friends, and they did not know. Like you're familiar with Joel Marion, obviously, who's a guy I've been friends with since I'm 19, and Eric Cressy and all the other fitness luminaries who have known me forever. None of them knew, and it was just something that I always hid, because I didn't want to bother anyone. I didn't want my problems to be other people's problems, and so on. And so it came out in couples therapy, and I couldn't explain it. I couldn't explain to Neg why, because I didn't know.
Did she feel responsible? Did she feel guilt, or was she angry that you hadn't told her? Or
no, to her credit, she was sad. And she was hurt, but she was incredibly supportive, and she just kept telling me how important I was to her, and how I was important to the world. And she didn't do the thing that people often do, where they try to, where they get inside their own head and they're like, why don't you trust me? And then you just feel guilty about shit. If there were a manual for how to handle someone revealing their suicide attempt to you, like she whatever list that would be, she checked off every box. She was incredibly compassionate and kind and beautiful, and made me feel safe. But she did have questions that I did not know how to answer. And so it came up a number of times between, I guess, maybe June or July and September. And then, I don't know, one day I wanted to write her a letter. I wanted to write my friends a letter and let them know sort of what it was for me. And, I don't know what else I am or what else I ever could have been, but the only thing I have ever really felt I was a writer. And for me, very few things in my life have ever felt real until I've written about them. And so I sat down to write, and the more I wrote, the easier it got to write it. And it started out as this sort of attempt to explain why I had attempted on my life, but really my depression, and coming clean about it and opening up. And it ultimately turned into something else. I mean, I think
it is the best description of depression for people who don't get depressed. I think it describes depression in such a way that anyone can say, all right, I don't have that inside me, but I understand more about how it works inside of you.
And that is sort of ultimately what it is now. I think for a long time, it is sort of impossible to describe. It's like trying to, describing depression to someone who's never really been depressed is like describing the color red to a blind person.
Right.
You don't have the language. But I think my intent for it was, when I wrote it, was for it to be cathartic. But the thing was, I realized through therapy that it was very important for me to tell the people in my life that I was suffering and how I was suffering. And I didn't know how to do that. I didn't know how to have that conversation with 15 different people, right, or how to start it. And so it ultimately became easier to write an article to millions of strangers, theoretically or hypothetically, or that anyone could access, than it was to sit down with my friend and tell him.
Kind of the worst thing that you have to do when something bad has happened is explain it over and over again to a bunch of people.
Yeah.
I think so. Having lost people in my life, people who are close to me,
yeah,
explaining what happened or why it happened, and talking about why it was so devastating to me, either because of the closeness of the relationship or because how horrific the thing was. It's just very difficult. Even what I've just been through lately, where I'm no longer dealing with people that I used to work with all the time. When people say, I really liked what you did, and my first impulse is to say, I don't do it anymore. And then instantly after that, I don't want to talk about it anymore.
Sure.
And I'm stuck because I opened my mouth. And I would imagine that being able to write about it in the way that you did took away the need for a lot of repetitive conversations.
Yeah. I mean, it fostered the need for a lot of follow-up conversations, but at least that first one didn't need to happen. It was weird because it's so interesting, like how things fall in your business. In 2015, like our goal was, as a business, for my company, Roman Fitness Systems, I was trying to be less active. And so I wanted to have more readily available content. So I did not need to keep doing the same thing over and over. Uh-huh. And so one of our goals was, let's collect as many questions as we can from our readers so that anytime in the future anyone ever asks a question, we can answer it by saying, hey, I actually wrote about this here, and sending them a link. And so it was like, it just sort of the same thing with depression. And that wasn't the goal. It was just sort of an odd thing that happened.
That's great. Here's the briefing.
Yeah, right? It's just like, hey, I've got some questions about intermittent fasting. Great, here, read this. So, ultimately, I wanted it to be this letter to my friends and family and coming out and being like, this is what I go through. What it turned into, in addition to being very cathartic for me, was, from what I understand, as you mentioned, for people who do not suffer, a very thorough explanation of what it's like, at least for me. And
I think it also gave people who do suffer from depression a thing to hand to the people in their lives as well. It's like, this is not exactly my experience, but this is a lot of my experience.
Right.
Like, let's start here, and then we'll have a conversation after that.
Yeah. So I don't know what I expected when I published that, but what I didn't expect was to get emails every week now, 2 years later, from people who say, I finally understand my father, or my husband suffers from depression and this has finally given me a look inside. Mm-hmm. and that has been the single biggest thing. It's much less often that I get an email from someone who suffers from depression, and far more frequent that I get one from someone who doesn't and says, like, this helped me understand my grandfather's suicide or something like that. It's very, very strange. So it's been, very gratifying in that regard, but it's a bell that cannot be unrung, and that's out there now. And as for there was.
Do you remember the moment you pushed the button?
Oh yeah. I remember going through the final edits and posting on Facebook for accountability. I'm publishing the most personal thing I've ever published. It's happening in a bit. And then like 3 hours later, I published it. And, it was scary, but, writing about it made it so much easier, because there's something about, I don't know, I think writing is for me the most satisfying form of masturbation. And even when things are painful, when I want it out there, I want it out there. And so, it is very scary, but
no moments of regret about having published that at all?
None at all. No. But going back and reading it now, there's a lot of like repetitive words, because it was very stream of. So I'll probably go back in and edit at some point. There's, I think there's just from the perspective of the actual writing, there's just a little bit of cleanup that can be done. But I've never, not for a moment have I ever regretted that. But it does have all these like consequences where now everyone knows you're depressed. So anytime you're having a down week, people are like, are you safe? Are you safe, John? Are you safe? Are you safe? Yeah. And sometimes you're just having a bad fucking week.
I remember asking you last year, it's like, how often is it okay to check on you? Because like I carry that concern around because I know. And so like, I haven't seen him post anything on social media in a while.
Yeah, it's interesting that's a pretty reliable indicator
of the whole
thing.
Yeah,
if I'm like not posting a lot on social, or if the stuff that I'm posting is a little darker, that's a pretty good indicator that I'm going through something. And maybe that's my subconscious trying to like ring a bell for help.
And I listened to the last podcast you probably recorded with for the show, whose name I can't remember.
With Alex Shulman, the Successfully New York.
Successfully New York, right? And the one thing that you sort of touched on, but like didn't reinforce that you were doing, that I was sort of screaming in my head that hopefully that you would say, was like I remember 6-8 months ago, something like that, getting a text from you saying, look, things are starting to get a little bit dark, and I want you to know, just in case they get darker. And you talked a little bit in that about kind of the accountability of that.
Yeah.
Versus just letting it happen and withdrawing and interacting less and less and less and talking less and less about how you feel. Saying, look, like you might notice, and if you do, then it's okay to check.
Yeah.
It's okay to check on me.
Yeah. I mean, part of that is, I've got this, I don't know, crazy fear about like people thinking that I don't like them, or of people not liking me. And I, sometimes it's depression. I go dark, and I don't want people to think I'm a fucking asshole. At least not when I'm not being an asshole. And I worry. I'm like, oh man, this, people aren't going to hear from me for months, and then I pop back up. So, I've tried to be a little bit more vocal about entry into a dark period. I will often post it on social. I'm in a dark time right now. This is what's been going on. And, I just want people to know, because, on the one hand, maybe it helps me. On the other hand, I think it does help manage expectations. But probably more than anything else is I have, whether publishing that article, whatever else it did, it has placed the mantle of advocate on my shoulders. And I don't know that was a goal of mine, but it's what's happened. I am very outspoken about mental health and depression and anxiety and suicide, and I just want to lead from the front, and I want to normalize talking about it.
I haven't wanted to break up the flow of the discussion to this point, but this is a good spot to say, if you're experiencing depression and perhaps suicidal thoughts, get help now. There are resources both at the end of this episode and in the show notes. Don't put it off. Deal with it right now. Suicide is the number 2 cause of death for people between the ages of 10 and 34, and number 4 from 35 to 54. The absolute number of suicide deaths is greater after 45, but as you get older, there are just so damn many ways to die. Over 1.1 million adults in the U.S. attempt suicide every year. Many have noted the uptick in suicides among members of the military. The issue there is that they used to have a lower than average rate, and now they're starting to look like the rest of the population, and because they're a discrete group, it's very dramatic. There's no way to really know how many people have thought about it but never acted on it. Show of hands right now, wherever you are, if the thought has ever crossed your mind. It's a lot, right? I mean, pretty much everybody at some point or another has thought about it. I'm going to put my hand down now and get back to the show.
So, a bit ago, you mentioned the P word.
Oh, polyamory, yeah.
Yeah. And that, where you are now, had to have been a series of decisions, or was it more a drive that you've finally just had to relent to?
Oh, man. So talking about this is really interesting. So that now we'll talk about my meta feelings, because it is this thing that I am aware that every time I'm on a podcast or anytime I'm talking about this, and that media is even remotely connected to like the fitness industry, as this one is sort of fitness adjacent in that we are both in that industry. Yeah. It's always this weird thing where I'm just like, oh my, am I going to be like the poly fitness guy? Is that what people are going to think?
I can tell you right now that you're not the only one.
I know, I'm well aware of that.
You're not the only one. I hear all the time, more and more all the time.
Yeah.
So
there's that interesting thing, and then there's also that that Nagar is in the industry, and there's this fear I have of people misconstruing anything I say to be about her in a way that it isn't, because it's not the case. And at the same time, now that we are both more public about our separation and divorce, there's a fear that people might, sort of assume that is the primary reason for that happening. That the polyamory versus monogamy was the largest issue in the marriage, and it was a large one, but ultimately, we weren't as compatible as we hoped when we got married. It's this really weird thing, because both Neg and I we talked about this at length, and it's super weird, right? Because we were like, we're not fucking famous in any real way. That's at all, not even a little bit.
Yeah.
But within the context of that industry, we both have some notoriety, and like, do we want to do this weird announcement about uncoupling, or like, what is it vain to think it's necessary? But it's, then on the other hand, you don't do it, and then you're on Bumble, and someone who is a fan of Nagar's content matches with me, and then I gotta have a fucking explanation to a stranger, and it's weird and it's strange.
Yeah.
So anyway, all of that to say that discussing this is still new, and I'm still
and only that you mentioned it is the only reason that I came back to it.
I'm totally,
we've been friends for a very, very long time, so I'm totally sensitive to your feelings about this.
No,
however you want
to. But I would not have brought it up if I wasn't willing to speak about it. But more than that, like, this is the first podcast where I think like people who already know me in some way are like likely to listen to it, and I can sort of like sit here and wax a little rhapsodic and sort of philosophize about like what this might mean. But end of the day, I have come to look at monogamy and polyamory as existing on a scale, very much like the Kinsey scale. Mm-hmm. And in much the same way that you can, like 1 is 100% straight and 7 is 100% gay, I think 1 is people who are 100% suited or need monogamy. And 7 is people who can only truly be deeply fulfilled by having multiple deep relationships of some kind, whether they're romantic or otherwise. Historically, monogamy's never been easy for me, particularly like the sexual component of monogamy. I'd always start to feel after a couple months, and I was like, man, like, fuck, this sucks. Like, it should totally be, and it's weird. You get in this weird like guy thing or whatever, where you just like, just no matter how in love with the person you are, you like, there's this drive, this need, and you often can't think of anything else. You just need to experience something else sexually, and it certainly has created issues in nearly every relationship I've had. Monogamy in that way was always challenging, and there was always this sort of voice in the back of my head being like, okay, but if not for this, you could be doing that. And when I met Nagar, man, I fell in love with her in a way that like I don't think most people get to experience. And it didn't work out between us, but like the fact that I had that we had that, even for a little while, is still mind-blowing to me. And that voice it didn't get shut off, but it got turned down significantly. The volume got significantly reduced. And I thought, all right, this is fine.
Maybe this is what I needed.
Yeah. And also like this is manageable. The volume is manageable. And being in that relationship and the marriage and Neg is if I've ever met a person who is like a 1 on that scale, it's Neg. She is a monogamist. She wants complete monogamy and like emotional and physical, and she also like wants full transparency. I grew up, being thoroughly abused and like learned how to lie at a very early age to keep myself from getting in trouble, or to if I showed up at school with marks on my body, to keep my abusers from getting into trouble. And so I compartmentalized things, and it became pretty second nature for me to have some sort of interaction with someone that I thought, Neg might not love this if I went to lunch with this person, and then like just not tell her or to lie about it, and that created all sorts of issues. So when I started to really look at things therapeutically, I did a deep dive into my own history, right? And when I look back at the landscape of my relational history, some things became clear to me. Like there's always been some sort of secondary input, emotionally or otherwise. And if I had my high school girlfriend, she was my girlfriend, and we did boyfriend girlfriend thing. But then there was this other girl who was like my best friend, and we watched Buffy the Vampire Slayer together. And no, you can't watch it with us. It's our thing, and we'll go to the mall together, and we'll shop, and we'll do whatever. And it was very much like having this secondary relationship that was separate. And but that girl was this girl's friend, and like we all hung out together, and it was like this triad of sorts, and that repeated itself over and over and over in my life, except in a few occasions. And when there wasn't that secondary input, that is when I would sabotage the relationship, because I would go out seeking, and then because I am also a person with depression, those mistakes would haunt me, and I would feel shitty about them, and I'm a terrible person, and all of this stuff. And I first became aware of polyamory. I had open-ish relationships in that there were people who I was dating casually, and we were just like, okay, we're, together, we're not, or whatever. And, we would just like fuck other people. But I had never had a serious relationship that was non-monogamous. And I first became exposed to that through another best-selling author, a guy named Michael Ellsberg, who I'm not outing anyone. He is very publicly poly. It was in 2012, and there was a book release party, and I knew Michael and wound up meeting his fiance or wife at the time, And we just sort of started talking. And then she texted me later in that evening, and she was like, "Hey, we're poly. This is a thing. I would love to like go out with you." And I was like, and like sort of blew my mind. And I was like, "Oh, this is super new for me." It was a very nice text message, very complimentary, hit all the right spots in terms of my ego. And I wound up having a conversation with Michael about it. And I was like, all right, this is too weird for me. Like, I'm not like, I appreciate your enthusiasm and your approval. I'm just like not in a place where I'm ready to fuck your wife though. Thank you. Thank you, but no thank you.
I shouldn't laugh, but it is funny.
Yeah.
Stating it quite that way.
Yeah, and then
I shouldn't laugh because the sincerity was there. It was not a lascivious offer. It was
like, you can have this experience if you're interested. She's interested. I trust you. You'll take care of her, whatever. And it just sort of stayed there in the back of my head. And then as I began to have all these issues in other ways later on, I began to read Sex at Dawn and The Ethical Slut, and and I just had friends who were either poly or poly adjacent, and would recommend these books. And a great friend of mine is a woman named Julia Allison, who is she's a journalist and an author, and she recommended a few. And I just like kept reading and learning, and the more I read, the more things started to become clear to me. And then I started reading some articles and blogs, and I sort of I prodded the idea a couple of times with Neg,
which I think you mentioned to me some time back. I think that's why when you told me recently, I wasn't shocked. I was just not aware of the current state. I guess.
It wasn't a series of decisions. I do think that for some people, being non-monogamous is a lifestyle choice. And I think that there are people who can sort of live that way for a while, and then when they want to just quote unquote settle down, that can be a thing. But then I think that for me and for many, many others I know in the poly community, it is more of a sexual orientation. My need to have multiple deep connections is as important and large a part of my psyche as being my sexual orientation or my all right, let's do it this way, because like I'm not like weird about my sexual orientation. I wouldn't say straight. I would say I'm like super invested in the idea of being with women, but like whatever. Sometimes dudes have blown me. It's not that weird. Like whatever. So yeah, I was
There's
like,
the biggest revelation of the whole show.
Hey
right
guys.
there.
I was like, it's not that big of a deal. I don't, and exactly 0 people who follow my shit will be surprised. But so yeah, like, but my gender identity is like, I've never felt like I was anything other than a guy.
Right.
So, but like me, when I think about being poly and needing these various types of relationships, that is as important to me as like my understanding of myself as a man. And there's no separation between the two. I am a guy, and I am poly, and I am all of the other things I am. It's like, I can't stop being a guy. I can't decide tomorrow that I'm a woman. The people who,
but I don't think that works that way for anybody, though. Honestly, no. I think that's something that grows over time in the head of someone who becomes who eventually comes out as trans. Sure. Those thoughts are already there.
Right. Exactly.
You don't make a lane change like that just out of the blue without ever having looked at the other lane and said, I kind of like that lane better.
Right.
If you're interested in how social norms and acceptance have changed over time relative to polyamory, check out an article that's linked in the show notes. It's called 3 Waves of Polyamory, A Select History of Non-Monogamy. It's very enlightening that attitudes about this are not static. Another thing you'll find in the show notes is something that Roman's about to bring up here. That's an episode of the Powercast, number 107, with Janae Kroslewski. Bodybuilder powerlifter known as Matt Kroc outed as transgender shortly before we recorded that episode. I think we did a really good job with that. It's one of the things I'm most proud of relative to that show. And I'm also very proud of the powerlifting community for having been so accepting. The powerlifting community can be pretty hypermasculine and pretty conservative, but those things did not keep most people from embracing Janae for who she is.
Right. I think, but there's, and I think that like your association with the various communities is beautiful. Like I think that, one of the most surprising things in the world to me is how people have so readily embraced Janae Kroc.
Yeah.
And, there's nobody really who questions that deep down Matt has always been Janae. And fought against that in any way that she could. And Janae is a woman. It's just, that's it. Well, I think she's identifying more as fluid now. And that's, but so for me, my hope is that when I say, honestly, like I'm a non-monogamous person, that is my sexual orientation, that's my alignment. People don't imagine that I'm just some, like libidinous creature who just like can't get enough young pussy.
Satyr.
Yeah, I'm not, it's not, I'm not trying to like throw bacchanalian orgies all the time. It's just,
although if there are any going on, somebody should definitely give us a text.
Yeah, no, I'm not into it, but it's an orientation. And if, again, I said this on the other podcast, as I said earlier, there was never a point where I wished Negar could be poly, or where I wished that Negar would love New York. It was always me wishing it was the other way, and I spent so much time wishing that I could just be monogamous. But I had all this social programming, and I always like looked at what it meant to be a good guy, and to you get to this point, you settle down, and you have a wife and a kid, and you take care of them, and so ultimately, what happened for me. I tried to work through this in therapy, and I tried to analyze it out. I tried everything. And I went to SA meetings, and so I, for a while, I guess I was identifying as a sex addict because like, if you can't stop yourself, if you need this thing that falls outside the norm of what we consider to be, I hate words like normal, but if it falls outside the bounds of what is considered to be typical sexual behavior, you're in some way considered to be a sex addict, especially if it is compulsive in some way. And compulsion is normally defined by how it affects the other pieces of your life.
Right.
Like in the DSM-4, for example, you weren't an alcoholic if alcohol, even if you like physically needed it, if you were physically dependent on it, you weren't an alcoholic if it didn't interfere with your ability to have social and professional performance.
So basically, if you were still functional.
If you were a functional alcoholic, you were like not technically an alcoholic.
Not technically an alcoholic.
And so ultimately, in a lot of ways, any addiction comes down to interference with your life and compulsion. Mm-hmm. And, by those definitions, I guess I sort of fit the mold in that I did feel compelled and was often making decisions that did seem to be fucking up my life. And so I go to these SA meetings, Sex Addicts Anonymous. And I'm like, I'm in there and trying to like do the work and go through this stuff. And I remember I would go to this one meeting in like Culver City, still living in California at the time. And there was this guy there who was at a lot of the same meetings I was, and he identified as gay. And he just had this thing, and I'm gonna say it in a funny way, but it's if you really think about it, it's not at all. He just could not, if he went to a bar, he just like could not leave without sucking a dick. And again, sounds funny, it's like, all right, but like that's a real fucking compulsion. And he just like needed to, that was just his thing. And as earnest as I'm being about it now, or as jocular as other people may be receiving it, that was his experience. Mm-hmm. But being in a room with someone who's like, I can't leave a bar without sucking a dick, I just can't. And I'd be sitting there, I'm like, I just like texting other women sometimes. Like, this is not.
I'm sorry, that's the funny line.
Well, yeah, I'm just like, I'm trying like to, I just like, sometimes I text my ex-girlfriend and it doesn't even have to be salacious.
Yeah.
I just want other connections. And there were tons of other things that I did. It was certainly worse than that. But at the end of the day, that's what was going on. And then I was having all this like internal dialogue, and there was a lot of strife, and then MDMA.
Oh,
and yeah, MDMA was a big part of the final stretch of the journey, where I began to realize that this is not, ultimately. I keep using that word. I will attempt to stop. I apologize, people. I was. The clarity granted to me by this magical substance, I sort of had this vision where there are two houses, and in this one house, I was broken, and the quote unquote, and I was a sex addict, and the sex addiction was a resultant of my trauma, or I was afraid of commitment, or all of these other things, these horrible, horrible things that I've been telling myself for years and months, and had, whatever scars anyone had left on me by saying them, I made them worse by constantly picking at them and forcing them to open, and making them part of my identification, and constantly self-abasing. And then there was this other house across the street where this was not wrong, and I was made this way, and it's fine, and it can be beautiful, and there are ways to live your life that are not in line with the, heteronormative monogamy by default sort of, Western relational setup. And after a while, I just couldn't live in that other fucking house. I just like, how long can you just live in a place where you are by default fucked up?
Yeah.
And everything about you is wrong. And so I really just did a deep dive and began to really see that whether or not me being non-monogamous by necessity and really needing to have multiple relationships, whether or not it was a result of my trauma or any of the things that have happened to me in my life, was ultimately immaterial, because it is how I am, and I got to just work from there. And for me, I really do believe it is as much a sexual orientation or a piece of whom I am as my gender identity or my sexual orientation. So it's real. So it was never a series of decisions. It was a series of realizations.
I see what you're saying. And living in this one house just became so uncomfortable because the way it made you feel about yourself.
Yeah. And also the way that I was interacting with the world.
Impact that you were having on the rest of the world as well. I can see that. That's a really good metaphor, though. So now you're happier?
Yeah. I mean, life is in flux in that, there are all of the complications that come with separating two lives that have, but I'm happier with myself. I look at the way that I am, and I realize, like, this is how I'm supposed to live. This is what's fulfilling for me. And I really, in much the same way people, there are still closeted people in the world, closeted homosexuals or closeted people who are trans,
right,
and people who are all of these other things. I realized that I was a closeted poly person, and and now I'm not.
I do not think that it is particularly new. I don't think it's any newer than trans is new. I don't. No. I because I think we all know stories of people who are our parents' ages and older than our parents and our grandparents' ages that had more complicated relationships because of exactly what we're talking about here.
Right. And I think that it can even be simpler than that, right? I think that we have created this false dichotomy of the idea of the purity of monogamy and that as the goal. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, I think that most people, again, if we're looking at monogamy and polyamory as a scale of 1 to 7, I think most people are probably not either, right? That's very extreme. Like the bell curve indicates that most people would fall in the middle of that standard distribution.
I think that when you talk to most guys in their 20s and early 30s, if they thought it was just an option, if they thought it was like they could check that box, they would seriously think about it because not for the reasons that you're stating, but for the being afraid of locking into one thing for a long time.
But, most people, I think, are probably, if we're looking at it 1 to 7, like 2 or 3, and which means like, they can do monogamy. So I think that monogamy I think that the presentation culturally of monogamy as the default and only acceptable way to do relationships, that is damaging in the long run. Having said that, I still think that most people will be more successful in monogamy than polyamory or non-monogamy, mainly because ethical non-monogamy and or polyamory require an unbelievable level of communication and emotional intelligence and like being willing to be vulnerable and all of these other things. It's amplified. And I think that if you look at all the people who have stepped outside the bounds of their monogamous relationships, most people, they're doing it because they need a new connection. And when they find it, there's what's called NRE, or new relationship energy, and they're happier for a while. And even in the context of their marriage, they're cheating on their spouse, but they're like buying their wife flowers and feeling it like rejuvenates them in some way. And I think that most people would probably be ideally successful in a monogamish setup or partnered non-monogamy, which is to say that like you have your wife and like every now and then, like maybe or you have your husband and every now and again you have like a fling for a couple of weeks or months. Maybe that goes on to be something significant. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe you just have sex with other people when you're on business. I don't know. I'm not a relationship therapist. I'm just giving my observations. Most people trying to enter into like a truly non-monogamous setup where it's like one of the foundational pieces of their relationship are going to be faced with challenges because you really got to do a lot of work, I think.
Yeah, I think that's true. Two things in closing. One, we've known each other for a very long time.
Yes, sir.
Back in those days, would you have projected the level of success that you've had now? Was this in your mind, or was there something else?
I don't know how to answer that because it's so difficult for me to put myself back in the head of that 25-year-old or 22-year-old person. And there was for a while, I remember being 22 years old and like having just finished college and like not knowing what I wanted to do and just like pushing it out of my head. Like I'll let future John worry about that. And then like the only things I got to focus on are like who I'm going to fuck this weekend and my bilateral quad asymmetry. I really got to work on that quad symmetry. That's what I'm focused on. And then, I got to pick one of these 3 women to have sex with. Or not. And I don't know. I think
it wasn't an you didn't have an idealized.
Yeah, there's never been a point where, at least not initially, where I was 22 years old and I was like, I'm going to build some sort of fitness empire. We didn't. You didn't know that the internet was as big an option as it was and that it would change and everything. I thought, like I'll probably open a gym if I stay in fitness. I don't know. Yeah, it's like maybe I thought I'd become a more popular writer. At the time, I was probably, when we first met, which I guess I was like 21 or 22, was probably at the height of my like true bro crush on John Berardi. Not that it's ever really gone away, but like that.
Does anyone's ever?
I hope not. No, I think I've never met anyone more deserving of hero worship.
I've never met him in person, but I have worshipped him from afar.
He's amazing. He's the best.
Where can people find you if they're looking for you?
Yes. For those looking for me, if you are at all interested in fitness information, you can go to romanfitnesssystems.com. That is the online home of New York Times bestselling author and fitness expert John Romaniello, where all of the things I've written about push-ups and eating and not eating and macros are. These days, I honestly, we publish a lot of external content. I don't do a lot of writing about fitness on that site. I write about business. I write about writing. I write about relationships and sex and putting things in your butt, all sorts of fun things. And so if any of the stuff that we've talked about today is of interest, it would be a much more efficacious use of time to follow me on social media. I have cleverly made all of my handles my name. And so just at John Romaniello on all of the socials. I apologize for anyone who's going to follow on Twitter. I don't do anything there. It's just auto-tweeting old articles. But the Facebooks and the Instagram are where I tend to play. Those are the sandboxes that I currently occupy.
Okay, and I always try to put the beginning at the end. So give me your name, my name is, and then who and what you are.
Man, it's like the hardest question I've been asked. My name is John Romaniello, and I am a professional human slowly making his way in the world. I operate as a New York Times bestselling author and consultant in industries that are fitness adjacent. I coach people in writing, and I am an advocate for mental health, depression, and the solicitous but directed use of MDMA and other psychedelics.
There we go. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thanks again to my friend John Romaniello for being on the show and being willing to dive into private, intimate issues and, well, just trusting me with all this. Part of my goal with this show is to have meaningful discussions about important issues, and the topic of identity, well, that's one that we all grapple with, I think. If you're experiencing depression or suicidal thoughts and you're in the United States, you can call the National Suicide Prevention Hotline at 1-800-273-8255. You can also go to suicide.org, which lists resources for many other countries. I would encourage you to read Roman's article on depression. There's something in it for everyone. On the next episode of the Less Than Obvious podcast, Brian Krall talks about his journey from being a guy with terrible stage fright to performing comedy many nights a week and running Northern California's biggest comedy school. All the obstacles he overcame and all the sacrifices along the way.
I don't know if there's a key. Just think if it looks easy now, for years, all I did was think about don't fail, you know? Mm-hmm. The whole thing, I think the reason I had such bad stage fright is because I thought about everything. How my wife at the time would think of me on stage. My parents, you know, am I going to forget lines? Look at how I'm dressed. Do I look stupid? Does my voice sound right? You know? Mm-hmm. Once I got over that, I never have that anymore. I've never had stage fright since. That's never happened since, you know, I was in my early 20s. Mid-20s. It just doesn't happen anymore. And I think I just got to the point by doing this over and over and over again, failing over and over and over again, where you just know, like, if I just have fun, it's going to be okay.
If you haven't already, please subscribe to this podcast on the platform of your choice and rate or review it on iTunes, whether or not you listen to the show there. That's still where most people go to find new podcasts, and good ratings always help people find the show. You can find the show on social media at Less Than Obvious everywhere except Twitter, where it's Less Than OBV, and on the website, lessthanobvious.com. Remember, being nice doesn't cost you anything, but it can be worth a whole lot to somebody else. I'll talk to you next time.